Picture this. Paris, 1945. The city of light has been liberated for months, but something dark is happening in the streets. Women are being dragged from their homes. Their heads are shaved in public squares while crowds cheer. Their crime? Loving the wrong person during the occupation. This was France in 1945, a country caught between celebration and revenge, liberation and chaos. The Nazis were gone, but the trauma they left behind was just beginning to surface. What happened in France that year wasn't just about victory. It was about a nation trying to remember who it was while punishing those who had forgotten. When 1945 began, parts of France were still occupied. German forces clung to pockets along the eastern border and the Atlantic coast. French towns woke up each morning not knowing if they'd be free by sunset. The Battle of Alsace raged through January, with French forces fighting house to house to reclaim their own territory. Snow covered the bodies in the streets, civilians hid in cellars, listening to artillery shake the walls above them. By spring, the last German soldiers finally surrendered. But freedom came with a price tag France couldn't afford. The country was broken, starving, and angry, and that anger needed somewhere to go. They called it the épuration sauvage, the wild purge. Before the trials, before the courts, before any semblance of justice, French citizens took revenge into their own hands. Approximately 20,000 people were executed in the streets, forests, and back alleys of France between 1944 and 1945. Some were genuine collaborators who had sent neighbors to concentration camps. Others were guilty of nothing more than suspicion or old grudges. No trial, no defense, just a bullet or a noose and a shallow grave. Local resistance fighters became judge, jury, and executioner. In some villages, the bodies piled up so fast they couldn't bury them quickly enough. This was liberation's shadow side, and it terrified even those who welcomed freedom. But nothing symbolized France's rage quite like what happened to the women. At least 20,000 French women had their heads publicly shaved for horizontal collaboration, sleeping with German soldiers during the occupation. They were stripped, sometimes naked, paraded through streets while crowds spat on them and threw stones. Mothers held up children to watch. Photographers captured their humiliation for posterity. Some of these women had genuinely collaborated with the enemy. Others had simply fallen in love or traded intimacy for food to feed their families during starvation. France didn't care about the nuance. These women became scapegoats for a nation's shame, punished for a betrayal that felt personal to everyone who had suffered under occupation. Meanwhile, Charles de Gaulle walked a tightrope between chaos and control. He had declared himself leader of the provisional government, but his authority was more symbolic than real. Communist resistance fighters controlled entire regions and weren't eager to surrender their weapons. They'd fought the Nazis while de Gaulle was in exile, and now they wanted their share of power. France stood on the edge of civil war. De Gaulle knew he needed to unite the country fast or watch it tear itself apart. His solution was brilliant and brutal. Absorb the resistance into official French forces, give them legitimacy, then slowly strip away their independence. It worked, but barely. The communists would remember this betrayal for decades. Hunger consumed France as relentlessly as any army. German occupation had stripped the country bare. Food production had collapsed. Transportation networks were destroyed. Ration cards gave you the right to buy bread that didn't exist. The average Parisian consumed about 1,500 calories a day, barely enough to survive. Children developed rickets. Adults grew thin and desperate. Black markets flourished in every city, where those with money or connections could buy butter, meat, or eggs at 10 times the legal price. For everyone else, there was watery soup and endless hunger. American aid would eventually arrive, but in early 1945, France was slowly starving while celebrating its freedom. The irony wasn't lost on anyone standing in breadlines.
The trials began in earnest that spring. Not the rough justice of the streets, but official courts designed to punish collaboration. Philippe Pétain, the elderly marshal who had led Vichy France, was arrested and charged with treason. This was the man who had been a hero in World War I, who had surrendered France to Hitler, who had sent Jews to death camps while claiming to protect French sovereignty. His trial became a national reckoning. Was Vichy France legitimate or a puppet regime? Had Pétain saved France or betrayed it? The courtroom arguments tore open wounds that had barely begun to heal. In August, he was sentenced to death. De Gaulle would later commute it to life imprisonment, but the verdict sent a message: collaboration would not be forgiven. French prisoners were coming home, but not the way anyone expected. Approximately 2 million French people had been deported during the war, sent to Germany as forced laborers, prisoners of war, or concentration camp inmates. Throughout 1945, they trickled back across the border, skeletal, traumatized, carrying diseases and memories too terrible to share. Families waited at train stations, holding photographs of people who no longer looked like themselves. Some returnees found their homes occupied by strangers. Others discovered their spouses had remarried, assuming they were dead. The concentration camp survivors were the worst. They returned to a France that didn't want to hear about the horrors they had witnessed. People looked away, changed the subject. It would take decades before France could face what had really happened in those camps. Women were finally given the right to vote in April 1945. After years of fighting in the resistance, hiding refugees, and keeping the country alive during occupation, French women cast their first ballots in municipal elections. It sounds like progress, and it was, but it also revealed France's deep contradictions. The same country that shaved women's heads for sleeping with Germans now handed them voting rights. The same society that had resisted female suffrage for decades suddenly embraced it, partly because de Gaulle needed their political support. These women voted while surrounded by the ruins of their cities, while their husbands and sons were still prisoners in Germany, while food remained scarce and justice remained violent. Their participation was historic. It was also complicated.
Culturally, France was experiencing a strange renaissance amid the rubble. Existentialism exploded onto the scene, with philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir holding court in Café de Flore, discussing freedom, authenticity, and moral responsibility in a world that had just demonstrated humanity's capacity for absolute evil. Artists and writers who had spent the occupation in hiding or exile returned to Paris. The city's intellectual cafes buzzed with debate and cigarette smoke. But this renaissance was haunted. Every conversation about freedom happened in the shadow of collaboration. Every celebration of survival carried guilt for those who hadn't. French culture in 1945 was trying to answer an impossible question. How do you rebuild meaning when meaning itself has been destroyed? The economic situation bordered on catastrophic. France's infrastructure was devastated. Bridges were blown, railways were torn up, factories were stripped or destroyed. The country had essentially lost 5 years of economic development and now needed to rebuild from scratch while broke and starving. Inflation spiraled out of control. The franc lost value almost daily. Workers went on strike demanding higher wages, but there was no money to pay them. The government printed more currency, which only made inflation worse. France desperately needed American aid, but accepting it meant accepting American influence. De Gaulle resisted, trying to preserve French independence, but reality was harsh. Without outside help, France couldn't survive. Pride would have to wait. Survival came first. By the end of 1945, France was still broken, still divided, still searching for itself. The war in Europe had ended, but the war inside France continued, fought with words and memories instead of bullets. Collaborators sat in prisons awaiting trial. Resistance heroes discovered that heroism didn't pay the rent. Refugees remained displaced. Women who had been punished for loving Germans tried to rebuild their lives in the shadows. And underneath it all, a question nobody wanted to ask too loudly. How many French people had actually resisted, and how many had simply waited to see who would win? 1945 gave France its freedom back, but it would take generations to figure out what to do with it. and even longer to forgive itself for what happened while freedom was gone.